on its first reading and look forward to work on it in the Select Committee.
Lynn Pillay.
Mr. Speaker, it will come as no surprise that along with my colleagues I too oppose this bill, and I want to acknowledge the sterling speeches made from this side of the House and also the contribution from the Green Party. I think it's really, really sad that the term, and I'm not attacking the former Speaker because I know he's speaking from speech notes that use the term sustainable. That seems to be the chant and the cry from the National Party. And we know that the definition, not the definition as you'd find in the dictionary, but the definition of sustainable in terms of this government is just clearly about cuts. And why would I say that, Mr. Speaker? Let me tell you, or let me tell the House why, Mr. Speaker. Not just you, Mr. Speaker, the whole House is going to know why I would say that sustainable means cuts. Because where do we hear, thank you very much, Paul Quinn is all ears and usually is when I'm speaking, and that's very good, and he shows respect, so that's really good. But when do we hear the term sustainable from the government? We hear it when they're justifying their cuts to ACC. When we see their cuts to ACC, they say the current form of ACC and the services that it provides is simply not sustainable. And so what do? They ruthlessly cut the services to ACC, whether it's relating to victims of sexual abuse, the most vulnerable people, whether it's getting people back to work, whether it's assisting people in terms of avoiding injuries. All of those things were cut, Mr. Speaker, because they were unsustainable. When again do we see it? The cuts to KiwiSaver, because they are no longer sustainable. We see the early childhood cuts, the cuts that see the building blocks for our children's future cut. Why? Why did the government not just be honest and say, we don't want to put our money in this particular area, we just want to give it in tax cuts to the wealthy? No, they use the term again, it is not sustainable. And I'm rather, because there are some aspects of Simon Power, and I acknowledge that he's going to be leaving, and I would have thought that his swan song, that his final action before he left would have been something really progressive, and that would have been something that we on this side of the House would have celebrated, because we know that Simon Power certainly by no means amongst the worst in the government, on the government benches. In fact, I would go so far as to say in this House that he would be up there amongst the best, amongst, some may say, a motley lot, but certainly I know others wouldn't on the government side, Mr. Speaker, but certainly not someone that you would expect to see using the term sustainable to cover that are actually cuts. And when we talk about cuts in terms of legal assistance, Mr. Speaker, it is actually really serious. All the cuts I spoke about before in the name of sustainability were all serious and all have a very dramatic effect on people's, whether it's children's ability to have access to quality early childhood education, whether it's about people's ability to save, whether it's about people having their rights and entitlements as were originally designed under ACC. All of those things are really important. But what we are talking about in this case, Mr. Speaker, in the name of sustainability, is cutting access to justice. And that is what is at the very heart of our democracy, in terms of something that, if you ask any New Zealander, what they hold very dear, and that is the ability to have, for anyone, no matter of what means, to have access to justice. So unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this bill takes New Zealand backwards in that way. And just we note that there is more expectation for community law centres, and I want to, as I have many times in this House, acknowledge the work that community law centres throughout this country do. And I don't think anybody would argue, I don't think there would be any dissent about the work that they do. But we see a minister who wants a greater role for community law centres, but it just can't happen if those law centres don't get the resources that they need to handle more work. And we've already had the Minister on record telling community law centres that there will be no more money. So what we see is law centres that I know in Waitakere, and I know it's the case in most places throughout New Zealand, who operate on the sniff of an oily rag. They really do fantastic service. What this government's saying is, yep, you're doing a great job, we want you to do more, but by the way, there's no more funding. So that's not going to work either. So we look also, whilst we're talking about, and I see Chris Finlayson in the House, and I know he won't be surprised if I relate to a couple of things. We see the domestic violence bill that was introduced under Labor that is still languishing on the order paper, very near the bottom, and I think that's a severe disservice. I think that's one area where the Minister has let us, another area where the Minister's let us down. That bill is there, and instead we've seen some measures that certainly improve conditions for victims of domestic violence, but introduced in a piecemeal way that don't complement and don't give complete protection. So that's another area, Mr Speaker, that we're very disappointed in. And of course, the Sentencing Council. Now, we on this side of the House know that if we, under Labor, if there had been a Sentencing Council, as Labor was very keen to do, as was recommended by the Law Commission, then we would have enhanced sentencing processes in this country, and that would be a very good thing. But instead, no, this government has, instead of working on improving our justice system, has rolled back the expansion that Labor did in 2007, making it harder now for people to access lawyers. At that time, and I remember when Labor was in government, we were criticised by the government about how we were not making enough legal aid available. So it seems pretty bizarre that in the midst of that, following that, National gets into government and in the name of sustainability introduces a new repayment and debt management scheme which actually penalises low and modest income people in terms of accessing legal aid. And how is it? If you look at anyone earning, a single person earning $22,000 a year, or an adult on $51,000 with two dependents will not, under this regime, have access to legal aid. Now that's appalling. That is absolutely appalling. That, from a government who $22,000, there was high income earners who got that in tax cuts in a few months, and yet this government, it is not rubbish, it is not rubbish, it is not rubbish. This government, Mr Speaker, is now saying that $22,000 is ample money for somebody that they do not need any access to any legal assistance. I think that is very, very unfortunate. I do want to talk about the public defence scheme because as members in this House will be aware, Labor initiated that trial initially in Auckland, and we support the concept. But we are looking at, there's a lack of balance in what this minister is proposing. And that what we're concerned about is with that lack of balance, with cutting access in the name of sustainability to people, and then putting more money or putting more resource into the public defence scheme, which Labor does support, is that there is going to be an imbalance there, and the jury is. We're hearing information from countries. I think just quite recently, there's some reports in terms of other. In England and Wales, that a vastly expanded public defence scheme does actually cost the taxpayer considerably more than it does currently. Now, what worries me Mr. Speaker, if that is the case, then what else is this government going to do? They've already lowered the threshold for people's access to legal aid considerably, and my concern is that this is going to deprive New Zealanders of their access to justice in this country, and that, Mr. Speaker, is not a good thing. Thank you.
Paul Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, there's much on this bill that I could